Think Forward. Think Research Channel.
Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce something new and unusual. We're going to have a team of experts really give us a broad spectrum translational project of violence against children, going from neuroscience to social practice. And we're extraordinarily fortunate to have a wonderful team of investigators in the entire spectrum of this kind of research, and I'll introduce them very briefly, and then I'll turn this over to Dr. Clark. First is Jim Clark. Most of you know as the Associate Dean for Research in the University of Kentucky College of Social Work. Also with us speaking today will be Alan Brenzel, who is a professor of psychiatry and director of the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry here at UK. Joining them will be Otto Kack, who is professor of psychiatry, pediatrics, and social work here at UK. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Ginny Sprague, who is the Buckhorn Professor of Child Welfare and Children's Mental Health at the University of Kentucky. So let me turn this over to Jim. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bakke. We're very pleased to be here. In 1999, our team gathered to begin to develop an effective scientific and clinical agenda for addressing violence against children in Kentucky and in the United States. As we began this effort, we soon realized that we needed to take a multidisciplinary approach that embraced pluralistic theoretical frameworks because of the complexity of this phenomenon, which will be part of what we will talk about today. We also realized that we needed to embrace transactional and translational approaches in our work, and that our mandate was to not only embrace best approaches and evidence-based approaches and best practice approaches, but to develop them. So today what we're going to do is to present kind of this intellectual journey from neuroscience to social practice. And the order of our discussion will be, we'll first start with Dr. Brenzel, who is a pediatrician and a child psychiatrist, who will talk about the neuroscientific foundations for understanding children's experience of violence. Then Dr. Kack, who is a child psychiatrist, will talk about attachment and the impact of violence on children's development and their relationships. I'll return to the podium to talk about the psychosocial factors associated with violence and their sequelae. And Ginny Sprague will end with a discussion of the scientific, programmatic, and policy challenges for those of us who are investigating and effectively responding to violence against children. So let's begin with Dr. Brenzel.
Okay, it's my pleasure to be here. I'm very excited about this opportunity to co-present with some of my colleagues here at the University of Kentucky. This is truly something remarkable, and we're excited to share. That's why we all four are insisting on speaking today. But our hope is that we can pull this all together and share with you what we think is something very exciting that's happened in a multi-college collaborative project as we head towards developing our work into a Center for the Study of Violence Against Children. The key that led us to our work and our collaboration is the fact that there have largely been silos or operationally parallel research endeavors in neuroscience and developmental and clinical psychology that have led to incredible advances in our understanding of neural structure, neuromigration, neurotropins, various pre-programmed cell death, and I think I heard in the introduction some of the members of this audience are conducting that research, as well as our colleagues in behavioral sciences and the developmental psychologists, but also social scientists. Early child educators. Early child educators know the importance of prevention and early interventions. I practice mental health, and I know that my work led me into child psychiatry was the need for early intervention and prevention. Now I'm realizing that I need perhaps to work even earlier and maybe go full circle and begin to work prenatally with pregnant women. But the bottom line is that even public health officials are recognizing that early intervention and early experience and exposure to violence, maltreatment, and neglect can affect a lot of health indicators, including blood pressure, obesity rates, heart disease. This is the human brain. This is the most complex 2 pounds of matter in the known universe. We're through now the decade of the brain. I think now maybe we're at the decade of the neuron, but we certainly know that the brain is sort of the sum total of how we relate to our environment, what our perceptual experiences are, and how we interpret those experiences. That brain is made up of individual neurons, and this is the I call the lonely neuron. This is an electron micrograph of a neuron that is in isolation. And what early experience is, obviously, is this neuron getting to the right place at the right time and getting connected with the right neighbors. If you'll pardon stealing someone else's title, sort of from neurons to neighborhoods, Dr. Shemke book. This is where we're headed. This is the fetus. I could certainly amaze you with many statistics about what's happening in terms of neural development. We know that there are 8 billion neurons present in the 8th month of gestation. We know there's a period during the 3rd trimester in which 250,000 neurons a minute are differentiating. And these are just staggering numbers. But where we're starting with our work is the fact that we've got these neurons in place. This unfolds as part of a pre-programmed, largely genetically determined process. But then as that child is born and enters the world, the process of early brain development is the wiring of those neurons, the interconnection. This is what we think is important in terms of beginning to look at the effect of violence, trauma, and environment in terms of adult interpersonal functioning and actual physiologic structure. So we've got the neurons in place, but what's going to connect these neurons? It's going to be driven by experience, and not just input, not just sensory input, but the emotional context and the emotional experience actually has a lot to do with how those connections are driven. There's 50 trillion synapses at birth. These are numbers that are hard to get your mind around, but by 1 year there's 1,000 trillion synapses. And then at 20 years there's only half of those. I didn't want to depress anyone by putting anything beyond 20 years. It just really goes downhill from there. I would like to tell you that if you pay extra attention during this presentation, you may save a few of those synapses. So that's your chance. One of the reasons that it's not new that it's important to take good care of babies and that babies need healthy environments, but the advances in neuroimaging, functional MRI, various forms of PET scanning and looking at glucose utilization has shown us this and illustrated for us in visual form, which is hard to argue with, this very process of rapid brain growth, rapid generation of synaptic connections. We know that the brain of a 1-year-old is almost like that of an adult, and that period from 5 days to 1 year is an incredibly miraculous period of development. There are, again, not news to this group, many different issues regarding how neurons get connected, why they stay connected, why this genetic unfolding exists, and what determines what synapses are formed. But we know that neurons that fire together wire together, and what neurons that are firing have everything to do with the perceptual and sensory input of the individual organisms. This is an artist's rendering of that neural density. at birth, we have a few neurons hanging around in what I like to think of as sort of a gelatinous mass. As you know, the support cells are not present. The glial cells and Schwann cells haven't produced the protective covering, and this is why we know it's so very dangerous to shake a baby, because these neurons essentially get scrambled. By 6 years of age, we have this massive web and tangle of interconnection, and then contrary to my own 14-year-old's notion that they're the smartest human beings in the entire world, they really have fewer connections than they had when they were 6. And so I have shown them this slide, although it didn't help. I'll have to let you know it didn't help. They still think they're smarter than I am. But this implies a couple of concepts that I think I want to just try to get through here and illustrate why our work in early intervention is so important. We know there are critical and sensitive periods. These terms are relatively synonymous, but a critical term period means there's a time in development in which a certain set of input or signals or perceptual experience must be present for the neurons to differentiate normally. A sensitive period means there's a period where those systems are particularly receptive and sensitive, as opposed to a critical period. Greenow and Black went on to sort of describe that there's an expectant aspect to neuronal maturation, and that neuronal development occurs and it's pre-programmed and genetically determined, but that there are these anticipated, expected sensory inputs that actually occur and may be sort of evolutionarily determined that, when present, allow for the healthy differentiation. In an organism that overconnects and overdrives organization, there's a need to determine which of those connections will remain and which of those connections will be part of the physiologic structure of neural circuitry. And for an infant, we believe that being held and touched and cared for in a nurturant environment with repetition is one of those expectant environmental situations that allows for this neural development to proceed in this organized way. There's also experience-dependent neural maturation, and that means that's the sort of experience that's unique to a given organism, and that causes that organism to become wired, or the connections to remain or be strengthened, and contributes to individual variation. We've long known about these critical and sensitive periods in many aspects of development, like motor, emotional control is like motor development in the visual cortex. When you block input from an eye, the whole visual cortex, essentially, those cells die off. But what's new is we're beginning to understand that there are these windows of opportunity, these periods of vulnerability, these opportunities, again, for emotional control and social attachment. And this is what we're interested in looking at. Another term is brain plasticity. Human brain has lots of plasticity, meaning that these critical and sensitive periods may be longer. This allows for more learning, but it also prolongs the period of vulnerability. And plasticity is not uniform across all areas of the brain. But what we know is it takes less time, intensity, and repetition to actually develop the neural systems than it does to reorganize. This is why in my work as a child psychiatrist, it's very difficult sometimes when I'm treating an adolescent who's had multiple out-of-home placements, been in foster care, had their relationships disrupted. I feel like I'm managing a chronic condition as opposed to being able to exact a cure. This is where that neuron, we hope, is headed, to this complex weave of interconnection. We know some of these are inhibitory connections, some of these are excitatory. It's amazing to me that more things don't go wrong, not that things ever go right in terms of the complexity. I'm not here to tell you that all, in this nature-nurture question, that we're coming down to the point where all of who a person becomes is related to their experience, but we now know about this complex interplay between genotype and the actual phenotype, which is being shown in many conditions in medicine. But it's quite clear that in mental health, many conditions are, just concordant enough in monozygotic twins to be confusing, and that there's it's quite possible that environment leads to variable expression of that genotype in terms of turning off various genes that are encoded or unlocking gene expression that might lead to maladaptive patterns of behaviors or even poor choices in that individual. What does neglect or violence do to brains? I could spend hours talking about that. I really struggle with how I could do this in my allotted time, which is almost up. But there's an explosion of evidence, some indirect, looking at the fact that violence and maltreatment affects this process of early brain development to a significant degree, that it will have a great impact in the physiologic structure of the brain, and then how that individual organism actually then interprets additional perceptual and emotional experiences. Children, we know that the stress axis has a lot to do with neural development and synaptic formation. And children who are exposed to a great deal of stress have various manifestations in their hypopituitary adrenal axis. And basically this lists some studies, 4 to 6 years old children that are maltreated. They did not have the typical salivary cortisol increases. We know that stress can blunt or actually increase ACTH release in response to corticotropin-releasing hormone. There's Romanian orphanages have a variety of difficulties, kids who are raised in those environments with their normal circadian rhythms in a variety of neuroendocrine systems. And in animals, it has been shown that cortisol levels destroy synapses. And so, those who like to be dramatic would say that cortisol bathes over the developing brain like acid. And so we're thinking about what's happening to these kids who are exposed to violence and maltreatment in terms of chronically elevated. Not just the hypopituitary adrenal axis is affected, obviously the parasympathetic systems, hyperarousal, elevated catecholamine levels. We know that resting heart rates in these kids are abnormal, as well as their response to stress causes them to raise and then not return to baseline normally. We know that a lot of the studies have been done with sexually abused children, and what we need to do is better understand how environment affects those critically periods in terms of capacity. I could go over again many of the specific connections, but I think what I'm here to do is to set the stage for you of the urgency of our work. We know that these children's brain volumes are smaller. We know they have a variety of deficits in terms of social and cognitive abilities, and what we need to do is identify the connection between specific environment, specific neural circuitry, and then I can't even begin to talk about resiliency, which is really where we need to move. There are many protective factors. This is just a visual illustration. This is a normal brain with the circles around the temporal lobes. This is an image of a child that was severely neglected for the first 3 years of life. The bottom line is those circles are relatively empty. And the temporal lobes have a lot to do with our interpretation of environmental and perceptual input and the emotional context to which we assign to that. So the bottom line is that the brain physiologically organizes and the structures created in response to not just the amount and type of experience, but the pattern and intensity of that. And now thinking about that, what is the most important perceptual and experience that a child may have? It's going to be in the context of their child-caregiver relationships. And so Dr. Cake's going to come up and talk to you about what we know about the importance of that relationship in brain development.
We've talked about the translational work that we do. And so that Alan's talked about neurobiology, and I'm going to talk about how relationships fit into our understanding of what happens to children. And central to our approach is attachment theory. And it's important to our approach, our understanding of cases, and to the recommendations that we make to the Cabinet for Health and Family Services for Children. It also attachment acts as a buffer, we believe, against the exposure to violence in children. We thank Dr. John Bowlby for defining this theory. He died about 17 years ago, a British psychoanalyst, and his work was instigated by noticing that juvenile delinquents in England had similar backgrounds, and they came from backgrounds of what he called inadequate rearing and exposure to violence. Attachment is defined as a reciprocal, profound, emotional, physical relationship between a parent and a child that endures and sets the stage for all future intimate and trusting relationships. If you think about that for a moment, that's what makes us human. And I would posit that all of us here in this room who have intimate relationships with someone, the basis of these current relationships was formed in our early relationships with our parents and the quality of those attachments that we made. When someone makes a successful attachment that keeps you close to that person, you develop a sense of a safe haven that you can go to when you're in trouble, and it allows you to develop a model of what that other person is like and then subsequently what you are like. You develop a sense of oneself in this process of attachment. Dr. Brenzel has already talked about the nature-nurture aspects of this. I'm going to focus on the human connections that we think has a great influence on the way the brain develops. And it's the quality of the interactions that a child has, an infant I'm talking about, that determines the way the brain develops. So that it's a very collaborative interaction between the environment and the brain and the way it develops. When I mentioned quality, if you go to Joseph Beth bookstore, look through the child rearing books, the main theme in all of those books is stimulate, 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 stimulate. That's exactly the wrong message to give to parents. The right message to give to parents is to interact, to be there for the child, to respond to the child, to imitate, to match, to mirror that child's behavior. As evidence of this, Dr. Peter Wolf got several $100,000 to look at the states of infant arousal, and he came up with this miraculous list. Isn't this something we all knew? But he said that one of these states, this quiet, alert state, was the state in which the infant is really interested in what's going on outside themselves. And the infant looks like this. Have you seen him do that? We want to take advantage of that state. We want the child to learn to deal with the world of reality outside themselves, the world of not-I. Here's where Peter Wolf earned his money. He said in any one period of time, the child is in this quiet, alert state, say 10% of the time. If, when he's in that state, we are there to interact with the child. Hi, here's Daddy. Look at, oh, what a big boy you are, okay? Then, in the next cycle, the child will spend a larger, 20% of time in that quiet, alert state. If we are there to interact with him again, the child spends ever increasingly large amounts of time in that quiet, alert state, which is what we want. However, if we try to stimulate the child out here when he's drowsy or whatever, then in the next cycle, this child spends smaller amounts of time. So the message here for parents is we're better parents when we respond, when we take the child's cue, if you see it as a dance and we let the child lead the dance, that's the way that we develop attachment relationships. We know that the brain stays plastic throughout the lifetime. That's relatively new knowledge. But the early years are what's important in establishing these basic kinds of functions, such as emotion, memory, behavior, and interpersonal relationships. It's not only necessary for this attachment thing, a nice fuzzy thing, but it's necessary for life. Rene Spitz demonstrated that when he was looking at infants being reared in foundling homes without their mothers who were in prison, that by the end of a year, despite very good care, about 70% of them died. They died of marasmus or anaclitic depression, and they just wasted away. It's as if their immune systems never caught up. The next year, he got mothers to come out of prison, spend a significant portion of every day with their children, and the death rate took a dramatic drop. So that the bottom line there is that attachment is necessary for life. Bowlby came to this country and worked with Dr. Mary Ainsworth at Johns Hopkins University, and they developed a strange situation test, which is a sequence of comings and goings. It was empirical research done with toddlers, 12 to 18-month-old children, and it reflected a strategy of the two of them, how to deal with anxiety, so that one could have a secure attachment with mommy and an insecure attachment with daddy. It wasn't the quality of the child or the parent, it was the quality of the relationship that they were measuring. They found 3 different types of responses: secure, insecure, avoidant, insecure, ambivalent. And then they came up later with a fourth category they called disorganized, which was all children who came from backgrounds of abuse and neglect. They went into these children, these toddlers, they went into their sixth grade classrooms. They followed them for 5, 10, 15, and on years. And they went into the classroom and said, teacher, what is Susie like? And teacher said, Susie is cheerful, cooperative, popular, resourceful, confident, hopeful. And they looked back in the records, and Susie had been a child who had been securely attached. Went into Billy's classroom, and his teacher said he's emotionally insulated, hostile, antisocial, unduly seeking attention, and he had been a child who had been avoidantly, insecurely attached. They went into Mary's classroom. She was tense, impulsive, easily frustrated, passive, and helpless, and she had been a child who was ambivalently attached. The bottom line here is that what we see in toddlerhood, in terms of the quality of the relationship, predicts future social and emotional health. That's a tool that psychiatry has never had before, the ability to predict in the future. Dr. Mary Main at UCLA has done the intergenerational aspects of this attachment and interviewed mothers and found that mothers who gave a denial or an enmeshed response to describing her relationship with her mother tended to raise a child who was insecurely attached, whereas if the mother could tell you a coherent narrative about this relationship, she tended to raise a child who was securely attached. Mary Main's developed the adult attachment interview, which is sort of the gold standard way of predicting attachment with the child, and it gives one a clear sense of the memory. There are implicit and explicit memories. In infancy, we know that none of us can remember our infancy because there's this period of time we just can't do it. But it doesn't mean that we're not affected by what happened then and that we don't remember it. We remember it implicitly. There's no internal sense that you're remembering something, no memory, for example, of a violent experience, as opposed to when you're older, you have that memory. Those implicit memories continue to affect us, however, in a very powerful way. So that although we may never explicitly recall what happened, the implicit memory drives us to think certain ways, respond certain ways, and so forth. So, for example, there could be an adult patient who does not have any implicit memory of what happened to them early in their lives. And yet from their current behavior, you know this person had a dismissing parent, a parent who said, what you think is not very important, and that's the way this child has grown up. She has no memory of that, but yet that's the experience that she has. And that makes psychotherapy then very difficult. If we don't intervene early, then we know that children respond in a couple of different ways with hyperarousal. So often these children are identified as ADHD kids. And another way they respond is with dissociation. And if we had more time, I'd show you videotapes that we have from our clinic of children in a dissociative state. By the stress of just being in the clinic, being with a parent, and so on, they dissociate and they just leave us for a little bit of time. So those responses are experienced in infancy and they become patterns for future behavior. So take-home message, the attachment process is key important in developing a buffer against exposure to violence and the importance and tenacity of early learning. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Jim Clark, and who's going to deal with more of the biopsychosocial frame.
Thanks, Otto. Given what we've heard so far from Drs. Brenzel and Cake, it would be good for me to report that the world today offers an optimal environment for both the development of the brain and for the development of relationships. Unfortunately, the exact opposite is true. We live in an extraordinarily violent world that not only provides suboptimal environments, but sometimes it involves quite insulting environments for brain growth and for relational growth. The World Health Organization Global Burden of Disease Study reported in 2000 estimated global violence-related deaths of homicide, suicide, and war-related to be over 1.6 million deaths. That, of course, if when they do their epidemiology for the past few years, will be much higher because of the number of wars that have broken out since the year 2000. But it gives you a sense of the the level of violence in the world that children are experiencing. I would also note that if we look at the total and look below it, we see a disparity. High-income countries experienced about 150,000 homicide, war-related, and suicides. What we find in low to middle-income countries is much, much higher. So immediately the context of how violence is distributed throughout the world and even through our own country is important to note. The WHO's typology of violence is interesting because what are we talking about violence? We're not only talking about homicides, we're talking about violence in three major categories: self-directed violence, interpersonal violence, which is usually what we think about when violence is discussed, and then collective violence. And violence, the nature of violence can be physical, sexual, psychological, or very interestingly involve deprivation or neglect. And I think that's a very important structural approach to understanding violence that is a premise of our work together. The sources of violence are multiple and varied, and I won't go through all of these different categories, but we are seeing the growth of the resurgence of child soldiers in the world, of children who are recruited into slavery and into forced labor. We also see children who are the victims of war and of major social chaos, which creates enormous public health cascade and major problems for children as they're growing. In the United States, let's take a more familiar ground. The scope of interpersonal violence is enormous. There were, in 2002, 2.6 million referrals to Child Protective Services across the country regarding 4.5 million children. Of the 1.8 million cases that were investigated, 896,000 children were adjudicated formally as being maltreated. That gives us a victimization rate of 12.3 per 1,000 children. And probably most disturbing, that a much higher rate of that group involves children 0 to 3. A very stark indicator of violence against children is the U.S. child fatalities. Homicide is the fourth leading cause of death for preschool children and the third leading cause of death for children aged 5 to 14. Incidence of child homicide has increased over the past 25 years, and we know that 61% of children under the age of 5 were killed by a parent. So as Dr. Cake described the absolute centrality of the parent-child relationship, what we also know that it is also one of the most dangerous zones for children in the United States. U.S. is the highest rate among the developed countries. And for example, Canada came in with less than 50% of the U.S. rate. And unfortunately, epidemiological consensus that these rates are probably underestimated. The numbers of children who are killed each year by homicide are formally about between 1,300 and 1,500. Most epidemiologists say that it's a very serious underestimate. We're probably talking closer to 2,000 to 2,500 a year. And if you begin to look at that in terms of 3, 5, and 10-year cycles, the number is extraordinarily disturbing. If you take a look at this pie chart, you'll see that 81% of the children who were fatalities were younger than 3 years old. So the most vulnerable children in these critical phases are also present as the highest proportion of victims. Different types of child abuse and violence against children involve physical abuse, which involves direct injuries to children, chemical abuse, which is a new term because of its seriousness and its growing frequency, which usually involves exposure to drugs and drug use in families, neglect and abandonment, which creates enormous problems in the developmental phases of children, sexual abuse, and then psychological abuse, which Otto touched upon a few minutes ago. Consequences, according to the WHO, involves a range of physical, long-term problems into adolescence and adulthood, sexual and reproductive problems, And then, very interestingly, and this is also being found in the general interpersonal violence literature, longer-term health consequences, that these populations of children end up becoming more vulnerable to cancer, lung disease, and a range of disorders that we have not in the past really associated with this type of health problem. The psychological and behavioral problems, which was a special focus as very important disease categories by the WHO, are quite serious in terms of children who've been maltreated. The economic costs in the United States, it is probably costing over $94 billion per year in terms of violence against children. In Canada, about 13.1, and in Australia, probably about 520 million. So we have if there are some people not interested in the moral argument, there is the economic and fiscal argument. What are some factors associated with violence against children? Poverty is probably a global factor that we see. The National Incidence Study of Child Abuse and Neglect found that children that were in families making less than $15,000 annually were 22 times more likely to be maltreated and 14 times more likely to suffer harm from violence. What is the mechanism of action? Well, we know that caregivers in poverty suffer from conditions, global conditions, that increase the risk of harm to their children, including limited access to medical and behavioral health care, limited social support, increased exposure to inadequate housing, transience, homelessness, limited disposable income available for their children, and increased exposure to violent crime neighborhoods, and overall increased family parental stress. Another factor that's important are caregivers raised in maltreating homes. The mechanism of action there is primarily the caregiver usually reenacts parenting approaches experienced in their own family. Caregivers are also suffering from stress response syndromes and are unable to empathize with and properly care for the child. So the attunement and the relationship that's necessary between parent and child for optimal brain growth is compromised by that parent's own childhood effects. We see that all the time in our clinical work and our research. Caregiver mental illness and substance abuse, and I put these together, although they are often studied separately because they're usually comorbid conditions. Basically what we see are the disorders contribute to low frustration tolerance, increased reactivity for anger, disinhibition of aggressive responses, and that these symptoms often interfere with reality testing and judgment, low empathy levels, and lead to withdrawal and neglectful behaviors, as well as often global exposure to criminality. It's an interference hypothesis, the idea that the effects of these disorders end up interfering with the parent-child interactions that are absolutely crucial for good development. Another factor that recent research is really showing to be a serious problem is the intimate partner violence. Some people have called this domestic violence. About 10 million U.S. children are exposed to their mother being assaulted annually. And another way to put this that Dr. Cake has often put for us as we look at these children clinically is that what could be more traumatic than to watch your primary attachment figure being physically assaulted. There's an estimated 30 to 60% overlap between partner abuse and child abuse. So although for years, unaccountably, almost fantastically, these have been silo studies in sense of silo areas of study, that we do know that children who are in homes where their mother is being assaulted are more likely themselves to be assaulted. And that seems to be a surprise to many people, but it is a fact. Who are at higher risk? The younger child, the child with a male batterer in the home, and substance abuse. Substance abuse shoots through all of these cases in a very robust way across all these studies. Children are exposed to caregiver assaults, and they respond with this chronic heightened stress responses. And Dr. Brenzel talked about the cortisol bath, and that basically this is what these kids are chronically experiencing. Child characteristics themselves have an impact. Children who are very difficult to parent are harder to parent and harder to relate to, and they can trigger anger, aggression, and fatigue avoidance. The caregiver-child relationship factors, the working models that parents form. If those have basically come out of traumatic and violent relationships, those working models with their own children will reflect the damage resulting in that. Finally, a plea for transactional approaches. One of our own studies from our clinic of 208 parents that were referred found 5 major areas that are probably interacting in terms of predicting more severe violence against children, that include a parental level of trauma recovery and substance abuse, the child's behavior, the features of the parent-child relationship, which is usually understudied, and family stress levels. So the key is that this area of research and therefore clinical practice involves a broad spectrum of comorbid disorders that are difficult and challenging to study and to treat. And to talk about those challenges, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Sprang.
Good afternoon. Well, my colleagues have done a really nice job of talking to you about a couple of pretty profound changes that have occurred over the past few decades that have dramatically altered the landscape for research and practice in the area of violence against children. The first is this explosion of research in the area of neurobiology, behavioral and social science that really highlights the inseparable and highly interactive influences of genetics and environment, and really points to the importance of these early relationships. The second piece that's really important is that our ability to utilize this knowledge has been compromised by the social and socio-environmental conditions that children and their families are living in. Poverty, racism, increases in school and community violence, changes in family structure. And the phenomenon is such that many organizations, in particular the National Research Council and the Institute of Medicine, have called for a fundamental re-examination of how clinicians and researchers generate and utilize knowledge. In fact, in Neurons to Neighborhoods, the National Research Council writes, "It's a strong conviction of this committee that the nation has not capitalized sufficiently on the knowledge that has been gained from nearly half a century of considerable public investment in research on children. In many cases, we have barely begun to use our growing research capabilities to help children and families negotiate the changing demands and possibilities of life in the 21st century." So why is it that despite a lot of scientific attention to this particular problem, our advances in understanding those things that cause and the effects of violence against children is still limited? Well, not only are these problems themselves very complex, but the process of doing the work is very challenging and it's complicated. And so there's certainly some conceptual and methodological challenges I think we have, and I'd like to discuss some of those with you. First is that children are exposed to many different types of violent behavior. We have interpersonal violence through child maltreatment. We have stranger violence and victimization, exposure to human and natural disasters, and wartime brutalization. This is important because in our studies of adult populations, we know that there are significant event-specific phenomena that occur. That is, that there are exposure characteristics that have predictive power on the nature and course of how an adult will respond to an exposure to violence. But the degree to which these adult models can be applied to children is still something that we are unclear about because we don't have the research to tell us. Next, this violence is generated from multiple sources. We know that interpersonal violence, because it can be a disruption in the parent-child relationship, and is often occurring in the context of a relationship where the child is highly dependent on the parent for life itself, is often very chronic because it's hidden, and it's also very pervasive and destructive to a child. But we also have other sources of violence, such as stranger violence and chronic conditions for that children live in this world where there is wartime atrocities that they're exposed to. We also know that those that are at the highest risk for severe victimization are simultaneously exposed to many types of violence at the same time. Domestic violence, sexual abuse, physical abuse, and for children who are living in homes that are drug endangered, especially in those homes where we have, for example, methamphetamines being produced. These are children that are living in very dangerous environments, homes that are booby-trapped for the sake of law enforcement, homes where there are weapons, homes where chemicals are being produced, methamphetamines being produced in baby cribs. Children whose parents are disinhibited, have poor impulse control, and can't protect them from strangers that are coming in and out of the house, conducting drug transactions that might also be disinhibited. There's also this growing problem of child victims who themselves become perpetrators of violent acts. I'm talking about maltreated children who grow up to abuse their partners and their own children, bullied children that perpetuate school and community violence, and children who are exposed to the atrocities of war who are recruited as brutal child soldiers. And of course, as we have discussed today, that violence against children is often influenced and caused by other significant social problems: poverty, racism, substance abuse, mental illness. In fact, rarely do we see families in our work where those co-occurring conditions do not exist. And then certainly there are problems associated with engaging systems of care, involving problems in bureaucracy and barriers to good community engagement that we think is really necessary. So what are the requirements to effective science and practice? First, we think that any type of approach must be collaborative and multidisciplinary, and that the models that we use must account for the reciprocity between individual systems and the types of social systems that children are forced to interact with. We believe that the investigation should be multi-method, and I'm not just talking about mixed method research designs. I'm talking about approaches to clinical work and conceptual work that takes into account information from multiple data sources. For example, when you combine approaches such as observations, interviews, psychometric testing, you're naturally including data that is infused with multiple theoretical perspectives and epistemological assumptions, so that you have more robust findings and you're also increasing the validity of your findings and controlling for error. Systems of care issue must be included. Any work with children is important that we include the impact that some of the systems they are forced to interface with are included. I'll give you one example. Quite often, children who are involved in the public child welfare system are children that are traumatized many times. They're exposed to violence in their home, and it becomes necessary to remove that child from that home to protect the child. But in doing so, we are quite often inflicting iatrogenic trauma on the child, because as the child is removed from the home, they're quite often taken from their primary caregiver, and this may be the source of their primary attachment relationship. We know that that attachment relationship can be a buffer against the deleterious effects of violence. So it's a very complicated, difficult situation. And we think that the translational research issues must be addressed, that we have a requirement to do research that is clinically relevant. The technologies that we design must be tested for safety, feasibility, and efficacy, and that we must use global knowledge in such a way that we're open to making local adaptations. Finally, we think that we need to look at different dissemination strategies. Just passive diffusion through the production of best practice standards is not enough. We need to have to test different dissemination techniques to determine what methods are most effective in transferring the technology from the laboratory into the field. So what are we doing about it? Well, the University of Kentucky's response to this is in this emerging creation of the Center for the Study of Violence Against Children. This is a translational research center. It employs clinician scientists from across campus, and we, as Dr. Clark said, have been working together since 1999. We have a multitude of projects that are under the umbrella of our center. The CATS project is one that you may know about. But this is a partnership between the UK College of Social Work and the College of Medicine Department of Psychiatry. The work done falls under the category of basic and applied research investigations, clinical design technology, testing, dissemination, and public policy consultation. We are philosophically grounded in our commitment to the clinical scientist model. That is, that we believe that any research or clinical work that we do must result in demonstrably effective outcomes for children. And we believe that because we are the flagship University of the Commonwealth, that we are afforded some very important collaborations and partnerships with other systems of care in the state, and that has allowed us through this community engagement to influence public policy. And one thing that I will mention to you is that part of our partnerships over the years have included work with the judiciary in the Commonwealth, and as a outcome of our interface with them and this translational research we have done with them over the years, there has been a change of policy in the Court of Appeals so that now all cases involving young children have been ordered expedited, so that children are not languishing for years in limbo without permanency and being re-exposed to their violent perpetrators. So that is one example, we think, of how you can be effective in terms of translational research when you are actively engaged with a community partner such as the judiciary. So what are some of the model specifications? We believe in a lifespan ecological approach. That is that you can't be effective in studying children without considering the systems that they're involved with, and that we need to look at children's responses to violence over time. We must address the silo effect, and what I mean by this is in contrast to narrow specializations that are the trend, where you have different fields of study that have important information, but there's a lack of cross-fertilization across fields, so that any approach here must synthesize important findings from neuroscience, developmental psychology, social work, and different fields. We want to broaden the scope of inquiry so that we're not just looking at symptom reduction. We're interested in functional improvement in children. We're interested in mechanisms of action. We think that this leads to more robust study. I've talked to you about the translational research perspective, in that we believe that not only do we go from bench to bedside, but bedside to bench. And active community engagement is something that we think is crucial and has been a part of who we are since the beginning. These model specifications are played out through 4 primary initiatives, which I don't have time to talk to you about, but basically are 4 domains of work that we do. They fall under these particular categories. And let me just kind of summarize what we've talked about today, so that I can pull all this back together for you. All children are born with a capacity for adaptation and learning. Early environments matter, and nurturing relationships are essential. Society is changing, and these changes result in increased risk of exposure to violence for children. That interactions among scientists, policymakers, and practitioners are essential. And effective research and clinical work requires new conceptual and empirical models if empirical findings are to have any impact on clinical practice. And then just finally, as a concluding remark, this is a quote taken from the Institute of Medicine. It basically says a fundamental challenge facing the nation is to find an appropriate balance between long-term investment in human capital development and the moral responsibility to ensure that the quality of life for young children does not fall below a minimum level of decency. And we certainly feel very privileged to do whatever we can to address this challenge. Thank you.